All right. So thank you, everyone, for coming back together so easily and smoothly. I am pleased to introduce our next panel, which is going to focus on intersectionality, moral reasoning, and social justice. I am serving as the moderator for this panel. Oh, whoops, I will leave that up for now. Okay, and I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists for you. So Emma Yackso is a clinical social worker who's been working with LGBTQ plus youth for the last 7 years. She's a graduate of George Washington University and has worked in LGBTQ plus policy, juvenile justice, and direct service. And currently she is the director of youth programs and services at Side by Side, which is an LGBTQ plus youth center in Charlottesville, Richmond, and Petersburg, and draws youth from around the state. Dr. Onnie Rodgers is an assistant professor of psychology and youth development at Northwestern University, where she directs the Development of Identities in Cultural Environments Research Lab, or the DICE Lab. DICE is a group of folks interested in how social and educational disparities are both perpetuated and disrupted at the micro level of identities and relationships. Our research center, their research centers on the experiences of young people to understand how social groups and the cultural stereotypes that accompany them shape how we see ourselves and interact with others. And then Stacey Horn, who's a professor of educational and developmental psychology and chair of the Department of Educational Psychology, as well as an affiliate faculty member in community psychology and prevention research at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research focuses on issues of sexual prejudice amongst adolescents and adolescents' reasoning about peer harassment. She's also a former high school English teacher and has worked with young people for over 30 years. And then finally, we are lucky enough to have another youth respondent on our panel, Haiti Patterson, who joins us from Northern Virginia, where he is a junior, correct?
I'm a senior.
Senior, you just told me that, and I shifted it in my head. I'm sorry, a senior at T.C. Williams High School, and he will be speaking and responding to the thoughts at the end of the panel. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up our first speaker, who is Dr. Onnie Rodgers.
Hello, hello. This is very exciting. It's been a great morning. Really excited to be here. I'm going to try to use 2 forms of technology, so I have my notes. So wish me luck, but I wrote things down so I don't talk too long. But, we'll see how it goes. All right, so I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to be talking today about identity and intersectionality, which are sort of big words that kind of get thrown around in a lot of different conversations and situations. They can take on a lot of different meanings. But as a developmental psychologist, I study identity development and the ways in which youth come to understand who they are and make sense of their social groups, which then, of course, means intersecting social groups because we all belong to more than one social category or identity. The central question of identity when I think about the grounding of my work is this question of who am I? And identity, of course, is social, it's personal, it's biological, it's rooted and connected to both the very proximal or micro level aspects, right? Who am I? How do I think about myself? But that's also inextricable from these larger macro level systems, structures, hierarchies, inequalities, isms, if you will. And so that's one of the things that I find particularly interesting and compelling about identity is that it's both micro and macro. And so it's the intersection or collision of these two ideas that it's both something that I personally construct and make sense of, but it's also intimately connected and inextricable from those larger systems and structures. And so I like to think about identity and approach identity as this proximal lever to think about social change, right? So that it's not something that's just occurring within or relevant to the individual, but it's also relevant to the larger systems and structures. And so the way that I orient to this work, one of the central questions that I ask is, what does it mean to be whatever sort of social group or identity or label. And you could fill this in with any sort of label that you could think of, right? What does it mean to be a Black boy, to be straight and multiracial? What does it mean to belong in these different groups and categories? Now, of course, across any of these groups, there are lots of stereotypes and expectations about what society says it means to be in those groups, and that's incredibly important, and we've heard some of that work already with Dr. Ward speaking to us very plainly about the stereotypes and biases that inform social groups. But one of the questions I'm interested in is how it is that as individuals we make meaning of that group membership, right? That it's not a unidirectional or passive process where we just adopt what's being said to us, but what are the ways in which we grapple with, resist, challenge, and construct meaning about our own identities within these groups, right? So what does being a Black girl mean to you, right? And that sense of doing that identity work with ourselves and making sense of what those identities mean to ourselves is critical to identity development and how we think about identity as transformative for social change. So you could even just jot down, what does being a whatever, fill in the blank, mean to you, right? And reflect on that. And the meaning piece of identity is important because it's part of the motivating component of identity. Right? If we understand what an identity means, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but what we sort of subjectively attach to that identity, it's going to also influence then what we do, how we behave, the sort of things we value. Okay, so in my next 10 minutes, or less, I'm going to talk a little bit definitionally about what identity and intersectionality are broadly, just so we're on the same working page, and then just give a few quotes and excerpts from some of my research, which focuses on having conversations with young people about their identities, particularly around this meaning-making process. And then think about what the implications of this are for the work that we're all interested in. So as I said, identity is this question of who am I? It's understanding who you are and where you fit within society. So I want to underscore that my approach to identity, when I think about identity, when I talk about it, I'm not talking about this individualized I, right? But very much a social, contextualized I. It includes our thoughts and feelings. It motivates our behaviors. It's believed to be and constructed and shown to be this really foundational aspect of positive human development. If we have a secure, strong sense of who we are, it's a necessary foundation for being and doing in the world broadly. But of course, this identity is built within relationship to other people as well as the structure. So the people and places and beliefs and practices of our context, of our worlds, inform that process of identity. So the good thing of that, right, is that of course we're products of those around us, but we don't live in a perfect world. So unfortunately, that also means that context is sending messages and expectations that can be quite damaging and harmful. And in particular, our culture and society is built on a hierarchy of inequality, right? So that's sort of the foundation and starting point, is that we're stratified and organized as a society based on social groups and categories, race, gender, social class, etc. And these different social groups and categories operate together, right? So that hierarchy is not stratified only along the dimension of race or racial oppression, right? There's also gender and sexuality and religion and so forth. And so this was Kimberly Crenshaw's argument in her work when she coined the term intersectionality, which is the idea that these multiple dimensions that make up the hierarchy overlap and intersect to create unique experiences of oppression. Right? And if we're going to understand and dismantle inequality, we can't just tackle one dimension, right? We have to think about the overlapping threads and webs that are holding this structure in place. And the other component of this is that it's not just oppression that's at work, but also privilege, right? So these same identity categories function to bestow upon some individuals privilege and power. And so reckoning with both of those is necessary for addressing inequality. So identity, intersectionality, are sort of interlinked in this way, because as I move through the world and experience the world, who I am is at the nexus of all of these different social groups and categories. And as I figure out that question, who am I have to also navigate the expectations, norms, stereotypes, biases, et cetera, that are embedded within these different groups. And this is what happens in real life, if you will. And in research, when we try to unpack and understand identity, what we do is take apart each piece and typically study its different components. So what do young people think about race, and how do they grapple with this? What do they understand about their gender identity, and how do they grapple with that? I do a lot of that work as well. It's a complex idea to try and tackle. But just as we said with intersectionality, if we're going to address inequality, we need the complexity to understand what's happening, and the same is true of identity. If we're going to understand how it is young people are making sense of and navigating the world, we have to be able to understand the multiple components and lenses through which they're engaging in the world. And so I'm going to share a little bit of some work where I've been trying to grapple with this question really directly with young people, which is how do they describe and make sense of their intersectional identities. And of course, this is still limited because I'm looking at just two identities here. I'm looking at just race and gender, which leaves out a whole other host of other important and relevant ideas. But it's a starting point, and I think still informative. So this is from listening to some young people. This is just looking at Black and white youth. These are all youth who are in the same schools together, so pretty racially diverse schools. And so we can think about their responses as well in that context, that these are young people who are interfacing and interacting with one another across racial groups. And we just were asking them, what does it mean to be their intersectional identity, a white boy, a Black girl? And they're reflecting on their own identities, right? So as I sort of mentioned before, this idea of what does it mean to you? So what does it mean to be a Black girl? I'm just going to share a few quotes from the sample. Like, being a girl and being Black, those are kind of two precious things because they, other people, kind of expect more from you and they kind of expect less at the same time. What does it mean to be a white girl? People say I'm a white girl because I wear Uggs and I have Hollister stuff and I drink Starbucks. They're like, you're white, like a basic white girl. A white boy. You probably get more job offerings because you're a boy and you're white, which is terrible, but it happens. A Black boy. It's like because you're Black, so that's already enough, and then you have to be a man on top of that. But it would be even harder to get, because it's harder to get jobs. So across these are just four samplings. Two things I want to highlight. A, kids have a lot of different ideas about these intersecting identities. It's not like everyone just thinks the same sort of thing. Kids are drawing in the more macro ideas of like opportunities and jobs, and also the more micro level relational, people call me a white girl because of what I wear, or what I drink, how I carry myself, but then also recognizing sort of the larger expectations and norms, right? The stereotypes that come with being a Black girl, what people expect from you. And so one of the things that we've been noticing in these data is this idea of kids engaging with intersectionality across different levels. So the construct of intersectionality itself, as Kimberly Crenshaw put forth, is this structural phenomenon. It's meant to understand how structural oppression and inequality operates. From the psychology perspective, there's a bit more nuance to it. Sometimes what we find is that young people are engaging this question of identity at the intersection of these social groups as just a personal level construct. What does it mean to me? How do I feel about it? And sometimes it's more relational, and then other times it's structural. And so understanding sort of what this sounds like across different levels also gives us some insight into adolescents' awareness of intersectionality as it operates in their identities, as well as what it might mean then for us to engage and work with them around identity work that engages intersectionality. So at the personal level, I'm not going to be able to read through all of these quotes, but at the personal level, young people were engaging intersectionality as just what I think for me, right? So this young girl saying, it's not important to be a white girl because I like being a girl, but I don't really care if I'm white. And she goes on to say it's weird because it's like the most proud and least proud aspects of herself paired up together, okay? Whereas a black girl here in 6th grade is saying really the opposite, which is it's about being black. I mean, being a girl is sort of important, but it all sort of circles back to the fact that I'm black. And then this young boy is saying that intersectionality doesn't matter at all. Every boy is just sort of the same. And a number of boys talked about this, particularly around the context of sports, right? So that this idea of all boys are just kind of the same in that regard. But then, in reflecting on what it would be like to be a black girl, he says it would be very hard, right? More difficult than boys. So even when adolescents may not see it as personally relevant, doesn't necessarily mean they don't have any context of what intersectionality actually means in their worlds. And so we see this in particular at the relational level, where kids are making sense of their intersectional identities or how these things matter in their lives based on how others interact or treat them, right? So your friend group would be different. Teachers are more trusting of white girls than they are of black girls. So these kids might very much say, often would say, intersectionality is not important to me, but then tell a story about the relational dynamics in which intersectionality is still very relevant and salient to their experience. And then, of course, at the structural level, so this idea that young people aren't aware of or engaged in these larger structural realities, we see it come out when they speak about intersectionality. And these two quotes are quite telling because they basically are speaking to the same realities from their position. So as this white girl is speaking about the privilege that she has, basically by saying, you know, if she was black, she would not have as much privilege because people are racist. White people are racist. And if she were a white boy, she'd be at the top of the food chain, right? So recognizing the way in which these things have an additive or cumulative effect. And as the black girl at the next quote is talking about, you know, if I were a white girl, it would be different, and people would respect me, right? They wouldn't judge me as much, because you don't get judged as much as when you're white. So, a couple take-homes of why we should care about this as a component of youth development. First of all, is that intersectionality is not necessarily always personally important, but it's still relevant. It's still part of the ways in which young people are making sense of who they are and making sense of the world. And we see the ways in which they're challenging and questioning and resisting, but also just sort of accommodating and accepting some of that status quo. But it impacts their own sense of self, their relationship with others, and their likely their ability to then engage in sort of change and action. We also see this idea that we can't simply address one thread of inequality, right? So that's true in terms of how we think about structures, but it's also relevant to how kids are making sense of their own identities. If we're only talking to young people about gender or gender inequality, and we're not understanding the ways in which these other dimensions intersect with that experience, then we miss out, right? That a young girl could say, being a girl, a white girl can say, being a girl is really important to me, and I have all of this assertiveness around gender equality, but whiteness is something I don't want to engage with, and that's not relevant. And so we think about how that contributes to maintaining those structures of inequality. The other thing these data really highlight is that the psychology of intersectionality is far more complex than the structural reality of it, right? So none of these data suggest that intersectionality doesn't really matter just because young people say it's not important. That structural reality exists, and the psychology of it is how they make sense of it and negotiate that, and what are the consequences of being able to and willing to acknowledge and engage it versus not. And then in terms of thinking about how we apply and intervene, I think this idea of recognizing when and where young people and ourselves, right, are entering the conversation of intersectionality. So sometimes we are only wanting to have the conversation about the structural reality of it, and young people are entering from this relational or personal level. And so rather than saying, oh, they don't get it or they're not engaged, there's a way in which we can see that different levels give us something different to see about intersectionality. And it's not about one level being better than the other, but how do we use each of those three levels as levers for social change. So recognizing that we need the personal and the relational to be part of that structural change, and understanding sort of where that conversation is happening, which level, if you will, that we're engaging, is important for sort of fruitful conversation and thinking about how to design the kinds of interventions and supports that we all want to do and the kind of work we want to do to create change. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Hard act to follow. Good afternoon. I'm Stacey Horn. Big shout out and thank you to the conference organizers. It's one of the best planned conferences I think I've ever been to. Aside from the Chicago weather, which is probably our fault, so apologize for all the people who didn't get here being from Chicago. Maybe to follow on Onnie's talk, you know, one of the disadvantages of having to give your slides so early is you have a lot of time to think about what you could have talked about or how you would have done it differently, but here we are. This is what I'm talking about today. So I've worked in the area of sexual prejudice for about 20 years, so how do kids make sense of and reason about issues of harassment and exclusion based on sexual orientation and gender identity? And then how do we create institutional structures such as schools, juvenile justice centers, youth programs that sort of foster the health, development, and well-being of all young people. And so what I thought I'd talk about today is just a shift in sort of the safe schools movement, which is mostly what I've worked in. I'm interested in schools as a context for social development, having been a high school teacher. But then kind of how that has evolved and how my own thinking about how we engage in this work has evolved, in part because of some stories we were hearing from really diverse queer young people. So the Safe Schools movement, when I got involved in this work in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a big focus on survival and safety. So how do we prevent young people from dying by suicide because of their sexual orientation, predominantly sexual orientation, a little bit gender identity. And so the research was really around documenting the disparate risk factors related to kids who had non-heterosexual, non-cisgender identities. So understanding suicide depression in this population. Really kind of a deficit model. How do we help these kids not be sad, depressed, die by suicide? And then a little bit linking sort of those higher risk factors to sort of higher rates of bullying and victimization, particularly in schools, right? Then kind of mid-2000s, maybe getting on to 2008, there was a shift to sort of studying lives in context. So a recognition that not all school contexts are bad for queer kids, right? Some are really supportive. Some queer kids are doing just fine, right? If they have supportive families, if they have supportive school systems. But also then trying to tease apart and identify those school factors, like having a supportive teacher. I think somebody talked about that this morning. Like having a GSA in your school and how those relate to sort of health, well-being, and development of young people. And then more recently, I would say in the last 5 to 6 years, studying diverse lives in diverse contexts. So this idea that not all queer kids are white, which a lot of the early research was predominantly on white queer kids. But really more intentional inclusion also of gender identity expression as separate and distinct from sexual orientation that has its own sort of set of factors, needs, et cetera, in terms of how we create safe and supportive spaces, and increased attention to intersectionality and diverse experiences. So going through this work and doing my own work, 2 studies sort of really pushed me to think differently about my own work. We did, maybe about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, we did a study of parents' attitudes about safe school practices in Illinois. And we asked parents, you know, do you think schools should have anti-discrimination policies related to sexual orientation, related to gender identity? Do you think teachers should be trained on how to stop bullying related to sexual orientation and gender identity? Do you think queer students should be able to have a support group or a gay straight alliance? Do you think queer students should be able to go to prom? So it's a little bit dated. You can tell, like, things shift, right, in the world. And what we saw is that, for the most part, parents were pretty supportive of safe schools practices happening in schools. 78 to 93% of parents, and this is parents across a wide spectrum of diverse identities, evangelical Christians, Republicans, to what we would consider more progressive, democratic, liberal parents. They wanted kids to have a safe environment in school. They wanted them to be protected from harm, if we use kind of the domain theory moral definition of harm. Significantly fewer parents, however, supported school practices that affirmed LGBTQ students' identities and promoted their full participation in school functions and supported their agency and development, especially at the middle school level. That's when we see those lower numbers. 40% of parents saying, yeah, in middle school you should have a GSA kind of thing, right? So that, coupled with a study we did on discipline disparities for queer youth, and I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes from that narrative study where we were asking young people about their experiences of punishment in school. And these were, we recruited for queer identified young people from two different organizations. A young person saying, one time teacher called me out my name, I cussed him back, I got detention. Well, why did you disrespect the teacher? He was calling me a fag. He was calling me that. He said that I was going to die of AIDS and all that stuff. He was just like making me feel, like I said, when I was in class, some of my teachers would play along with the students and make fun of me and say stuff to me. And he'd always say, like, you don't want to end up like him. His life is going to be ruined. So we're reading these narratives of, this is beyond safety, right? This is a teacher not affirming a young person's identity, and even more, discriminating against that person because of their identity. Similarly, and mostly these were stories of queer youth of color. We saw some of these stories from queer white youth, but they're mostly from queer youth of color. So this is another student, Kiki, who identified as a trans female, straight. These are self-identities. She identified as colored. She was the principal, and she told me, you shouldn't be wearing wigs. You're dressing like a woman and doing all this. Maybe you wouldn't be getting bullied so much. So again, it's beyond safety. It's saying you need to change to be safe in this school, not that we need to change the structure of the school to help you be safe. So we're doing this research, and I'm doing my work on safe schools, and I'm thinking our safety framework isn't enough, right? Physical safety is necessary but not sufficient condition for ensuring health development, well-being, thriving, liberation, all of the things we're talking about this morning. And in fact, a focus on bullying reduction and reducing harassment has led to policies and practices like zero tolerance that have actually become harmful for the very people they are trying to protect. So with this same data set, we have a paper under review looking at the links between being victimized by bullying and harassment and punishment for queer youth. And for 90% of the youth in our study, their disparate discipline was connected back to some kind of uninterrupted bullying or toxic kind of hostile environment in their school. And 40% of them were bullied by teachers, just as an aside, or adults in the school, not just teachers, adults in the school. And I was a teacher. I know teachers work hard, but no adults should be engaging in those kinds of behaviors. And this was particularly true for our youth of color, youth with disabilities, and gender nonconforming youth. So the cisgender queer white boy, no issues in his school. Some of us have been trying to connect the Safe Schools movement to the broader education justice movement because of these intersectional concerns about when we try to protect around something, are we causing harm in a different way, right? And a recognition that we need to look at these root causes, structural oppression, hegemonic and toxic masculinity that's happening in schools, heteropatriarchy, and white supremacy. And all of these are sort of intersecting to sort of impact the lived experiences of young people in those environments, whether they're queer or not, right? So at the same time as this was happening, Martin Ruck asked me to write a chapter on LGBT students' rights for a volume he did on children's rights, global children's rights. So I was reading the Convention on the Rights of the Child. If you don't know the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's It's been around for a couple decades. The US is now the only country that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But it basically asserts two things, right? Children and youth deserve access and/or a commitment to political, civil, social, economic, and cultural rights due to their inherent dignity as members of the human family. So basically saying children are part of the moral universe, right? And need to be respected. And that there's a balance of rights focused on inherent vulnerability and dependency of children as they're developing, and that we need to protect them from harms, with rights focused on their inherent autonomy and agency of children as individuals, so that even young children have a voice, have a right to a voice, have a right to agency, etc. And in the CRC, if you look at all of the articles, there's sort of three overarching kind of categories of rights. Survival and development, protection, and participation. And these are not sort of clean distinctions. They do overlap a bit, because if you afford a right in one area, you might be impacting a right in another area. So just to give you a quick kind of overview of what these look like in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But survival and development are rights to sort of things like access to resources that allow you to develop and grow as a human being. So safe water, basic necessities, education, health and healthcare, stable family, leisure and cultural activities, information and knowledge about your rights, which I think is so fundamental, right? And within these, there are specific provisions for marginalized groups that may be denied access to rights due to discrimination, bias, or other types of cultural restraints, like immigrant children, refugee children, children with disabilities, ethnic or racial minorities. LGBT youth are not ever mentioned in the CRC as a protected category, but I add them here because I'm making the argument that, yes, they should also be extended to LGBT youth as a marginalized group. Rights to protection are what you would expect. Right to be free from violence, exploitation, and all forms of abuse, including discrimination, harassment, sexual exploitation, involvement in armed conflict, etc. And then right to fair treatment within government institutions, including schools, juvenile justice, child welfare systems, etc. So that you should be treated with dignity as part of the human family in all of those systems that governments are sort of in charge of and support. And I think all of these are relevant to our discussion today, but I particularly think rights to participation are relevant to this idea of dialogue and decision-making and democracy and youth voice. And the CRC really is clear on this, that young people have a right to full participation in their own development, in their families, their communities, and have a decision and have a decision in things that affect them. So this is not new to us who work in youth development. This is youth voice at its greatest, right? But a right to express views freely, to have dialogue about your opinions, about how you see information, freedom of thought and conscience, freedom of association, right to and protection of individual privacy, access to information and material that promotes your well-being, and then a right to be included in decisions that affect you. So if we think about this in relation to schools and youth programs, how could we use this framework to really think about how we shift the structural, the institutional, the relational, the individual things that are happening in schools that will create better places for queer young people, and really all young people, because sexual orientation and gender identity affects everybody in schools. So access to quality formal, and we're not doing well on any of these for many kids in most places. So this is sort of what we're shooting for, right? But access to quality formal education and youth programming, adequate provisions for educational funding in terms of facilities, classrooms, high quality teachers, curricular materials that are inclusive of SOGI issues, SOGI people, sexual orientation, gender identity, equal opportunities for all students to succeed. The video we saw before the break sort of really talked about that in Anacostia, inclusive and comprehensive curriculum. And this one, I think, for me is really huge, a right to one's own identity. So when you bar a transgender student from using the bathroom, that aligns with their gender identity, you are not affirming their identity as a human being, right? Oop. In terms of protection rights, this is what we've been doing in the Safe Schools movement for 20 plus years, really promoting safety and well-being of all students. But it also means freedom and discrimination from harassment in your peer relationships, in your curriculum and your programming, in your pedagogy, in the policies at the schools. Support for health and well-being of all students, so comprehensive and inclusive sexuality to me is a protective right because it allows young people to have the information they need to protect themselves. And then appropriate approaches to discipline, I think, is a protection right. How are we not engaging in more harms to young people by how we are holding them accountable when they're not sort of acting in accordance with sort of how we want people to be in a community, right? And I love Sean's example, if he's still here, of how they have a young person come back and present to the community to say, here's what I did wrong, right? And then in terms of participation rights, this is the one we're most afraid of with young people. We don't really want young people to talk in schools or to really speak their minds. You know, it's scary to be a teacher and have somebody say to you, I think you're wrong, right? You gotta do a lot of work yourself to sort of be in a place to allow that to happen, right? So how do we engage in it? And youth programs do this way better than schools. Youth programs really do this, which is why I think having access to both of those spaces is so important for young people. But avenues for youth voice, including avenues for diverse viewpoint, including youth in decision-making, access to information is huge, access to being able to dialogue around sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, in your school with a trusted adult, with your peers, et cetera. Agency, and again, expressing one's identity, including diverse identities. In the longer version of this talk, I have even drilled down more to sort of what this specifically looks like for queer youth in schools. But Jahari was very kind in saying, you have too many slides, you're not gonna get done. So we pared it down. But how it does play out in schools or programs, we gotta look at our policies and policy implementation, right? Are our policies upholding the rights of all students in school? Is our dress code, right, upholding? Are we making girls do one thing and boys do another thing? That would be an unfair policy for non-binary kids, right? Provisions of and access to resources, formal and informal practices in schools like pedagogical strategies, educational and classroom structures, how we understand relationships in the school, curricular and program offerings. And all of these things, it's sort of an intersecting web, happen at the structural, organizational, interpersonal, and individual level. And that is what creates sort of the experience of a young person in an institution. And so the hope is if we sort of take this rights approach where we really are looking at all students have a right to dignity as a member of the human family, and we look at our policies, our curriculum through that lens, particularly using the intersectional framework that Onnie talked about, we can see where we might be creating something that has unintended consequences for a young person because of a queer identity, or because of a non-binary gender identity, or because of a intersectional racial queer identity, et cetera, right? So we're gonna do questions later. Shameless plug, Stephen Russell and I have a recent book, somewhat recent book, on sexual orientation, gender identity, and schooling. It's an edited book, so global, lots of diverse chapters, so please check it out. And again, a thank you to our funders, collaborators, our courageous young people that participate in our studies, and to all of you.
Hello. A similar shameless plug for, we use Stacey's book all the time. It's amazing. So yeah, it actually has a lot of wonderful implications, so go buy it. So my name is Emma Yackso. I use she, her pronouns. I work at Side by Side, which is the LGBTQ Youth Center for Virginia. I'm going to talk a little bit about Side by Side and the work that we do. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about queer youth and things that our youth experience, especially in Virginia, which means I'm going to further bum you out a lot. And then I'm excited to talk about some of the intersectional work that we've been doing at the center. So Side by Side is started in 1991. So we've been around for 28 years. We are in Charlottesville, Richmond, and Petersburg, which are three very different areas of Virginia. We have a lot of different things that we do. We have a lot of direct work with youth, so we have support groups, we have drop-in hours, we have a housing program, we have crisis services, we have a clothing closet, all kinds of things. We do a lot of work in schools. So we do training, we train administrators, we train teachers, we train coaches, we meet with administrators to help them write policies. We train youth centers, we train basically anyone that may ever come into contact with an LGBTQ youth. We train you on how to work with LGBTQ youth and make your space more affirming. We also do a lot of policy work. So we work with school boards, we work with legislators, we work with city councils, because we have learned from listening to our youth that them having a safe space in our organization is fantastic, and it's simply not enough. And that we're not actually going to further spaces and further progress for LGBTQ youth if we don't look outside of our doors. So a little bit about the work that we do and how we do it. We like to call ourselves, we're a youth-led, adult-supported organization. So at the core of everything that we do is youth voice. So I'm going to repeat a lot of the things that Sean said earlier, which again, we have the liberty to do because we are a youth program, we're not a school. So we have support groups. We also have a leadership council. Our leadership council gets a say in every single thing that happens at the center, from the different curriculums that we do every week to how the funding works, to when and where the prom is going to be, to what the center looks like, to what the strategic priorities are. So we have youth voice integrated into our organization at every single level. That didn't just happen overnight, right? To do that correctly, it's got to come with prep. You have to be able to educate and train your youth and make sure they actually feel supported in those roles. I don't know if anyone, I'm sure people here have been to a board meeting. If you just plop a 16-year-old down in the middle of a board meeting, I usually don't know what's going on, so they're not going to know what's going on. How am I talking about these things? What are the decisions I'm actually making? So it's really important to do the legwork with them so they actually feel supported and like their voice is going to be heard. You also have to do the work on the other end of the table and make sure that if you're going to bring youth to places like a board meeting or where decisions are made, that the people at the table are actually going to respect and listen to their voices. So we do a lot of centering around youth voice. We also, especially in the last 5 or 6 years with the current administration and political climate, we've been in survival mode with a lot of our youth. If I had more time, and I'm going to really try to stay at 10 minutes so we can get to questions, I would show you lots and slides with lots of data about experiences of our youth, but I pulled just a few for us. This comes from some research studies, and then also we do internal surveys of our youth because they are much more honest when they know they're just giving us the information. So we serve about 375 youth a year. We just did a survey last month. And unfortunately, these aren't that different month to month at this point, but 70% of our youth are actively suicidal or have been actively suicidal in the last 6 months. We have 42% of our trans youth have attempted suicide in the last 6 to 8 months. 35% of the youth that are homeless in RVA in Richmond, Virginia are LGBTQ. And 45% of our youth actively engage in self-harm. So why do I say all those things? It's not just, I always feel the energy in the room at that moment, just like sink. So I think when we talk about social justice and we talk about trying to get youth to participate in civic action and civic engagement, it's really hard to want to participate in a world that's literally not meant for you, right? The reason that all those stats are the way they are is not because being LGBTQ is really hard. It's because being in the world and trying to navigate the world as an LGBTQ person is really hard, right? And so how do we try and engage youth in talking about morality and talking about being engaged in their world and having dialogue if they literally don't believe that the world thinks that they matter, right? So we start at the very beginning, at the fundamentals of that. My job at Side by Side is for every youth to walk out the door knowing that they matter, right? They are deserving of love. They are deserving of respect. So when we talk about LGBTQ youth, we really have to, we really boil down to the fundamentals that come way before how do we get them engaged and, what is the right policy and all these kinds of things. We're really talking about your basic rights as a human being. Do other human beings think that you matter in the world? So I know I only have a little bit of time left. I want to talk a little bit about, since we're focusing on intersectionality. So Side by Side is the LGBTQ Youth Center, but we don't just focus on LGBTQ identities because that would only serve some of our youth, right? So one of the big things that we heard from a lot of our youth and listening to our youth is that they needed a space to be able to talk about, specifically our youth of color, needed a space to be able to talk about being youth of color and being LGBTQ in the same room. So they often felt like they had to choose and go to this community center or this program, and they could talk about being Black and all the things that went with that, or they could come to Side by Side and talk about being queer, but they didn't actually have a place where they could talk about how all those things work together. So we started about 6 years ago. We started this racial equity work within our organization. So we're still very much on the journey. So currently we have a youth of color group that runs in Richmond. We've continued to listen to our youth throughout this process, and we have learned first had to do work as staff, right? If we couldn't do racial equity among our staff, then we weren't going to be able to teach it and do that work with our youth. Then we had to work with our board, right? If our board didn't believe in the vision of what we were doing and weren't willing to listen to our youth around that, it was only going to go so far. Then we were able to get this group up and running, and then we listened to a lot of other youth that said, that's great, that's fantastic, I can't get to Side by Side, right? So it's great you have a youth of color group at Side by Side, and we were only listening to the youth that actually happened to be able to get to our doors, right? So now we're doing a lot of work out in the community to how do we actually be able to serve all LGBTQ youth in Virginia, which means looking at all of the different aspects of their identity and being able to create a space where we serve all of them, as opposed to just creating spaces where we serve LGBTQ identities in a silo. So I'm gonna make sure we have time for questions because I feel like that's usually the most important part and my favorite part. So I'm gonna sit down, but thank you for having me. It's very exciting to be here.
Hello. My name is Haiti Patterson. I go to TC Williams. I am a senior right now. I am also a Black man, and I'm also gay. Just to let y'all know. So, So I'm very involved with my school and my community. First, I am the president of a club called the Black Student Union at TC Williams. I am also in, I'm sorry y'all, I'm a little nervous. I'm in leadership as well. I'm a counselor aide, and we've been around for over, I'll say 35 years. We do a lot of things with youth and teens as well, and with our community. I am also a coordinator for AVID and for the ASA, so I'm very out there. Do I know some stuff about this? Well, I have experienced it. So with being a Black, gay, young teen man, it is very stressful, but I will also want to say that it is very good to me because I've been through a lot. When I was in, hold on, y'all, sorry. when I was in middle school, I used to get bullied because of the way I act. And then I had so much anger in me, I just fought and fought and fought. And then it was just like, well, he's black, so he's gonna fight, and then he's gay, so he's gonna fight, so that's what they act like. But lies they tell, because we don't act like that for real. And then it was just like, I'm just doing this, and like, I'm not focusing on my grades, I'm not focused on nothing. I come from the roughest part of Alexandria, Virginia, and it's like, this is what I'm supposed to do, and like, this is how I'm supposed to act. But in reality, we are more than that. The way how I made sure that it would not affect me in school is because I stepped my foot down, and plus I let God deal with all that had tried to come for me and like tried to do all these things that really had hurt me. I was suicidal at one point, but as you can see, I'm standing right here. So there has been a lot of things that has like really torn me down, but I've grown confidence. I've grown to know myself. I've grown in a group that has helped me so much. I've grown to speak. At first, I did not want to go to college, but I will be going to college in fall of 2020. I'll be going to Virginia State University. So that is one thing. And I'm just like very blessed to be here. And like, I'm really thankful for all the people that have stood by me. I'm thankful for the peer advisor program. I'm thankful for my school, my friends, my family. I have lost a lot of people to being gay and to being black in America. I think it's a problem that we should talk about, but like most people don't talk about because like they think it's like, okay, well he's gay, so like he should be fine. Well, what's that supposed to mean? Like, I mean, I just don't understand like what like most people say. But thank you and have a nice day.
Okay. There we go. Thank you. Thank all of you. So we do have some time for questions. I am going to I'm going to moderate from my seat and share the mic because we do have a performance after this panel, and so they're getting the soundtrack set up there. So, questions, thoughts?
Hello. Is it working? Awesome. Okay. Hi. I work with bystander intervention with high schoolers. And with that being said, we talk about very hard topics such as racial discrimination, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and what have you. And with these conversations, sometimes the LGBTQ plus community will come up, and there's a lot of interesting questions. And I was curious, how do you navigate questions that seem to be very sensitive and I don't know the right word for it, seem just very not knowledgeable in the whole aspect of what the LGBTQ plus community is? Does that make sense?
Is it on again? Yes. Okay. It's a great question. I would say it definitely depends on the context that you're in. So if you have an opportunity to be able to have a conversation where you can educate that person about what the connotations of their question were, or what are the things that you need to know, being able to do that is great. It sounds like you're in a situation where there's also LGBTQ people in the room, right, when someone's asking an offensive question. And I think in these spaces, it's really important to also know, hopefully you have a policy at your school, right, around our student, what are teachers allowed to say, not allowed to say, all these things, right? But you can draw a very clear line that a question around whether or not someone has basic dignity and worth is not a question we're going to entertain here, right? We're not actually going to dignify that with an answer and a discussion around it, right? So it's not we can't agree to disagree, right, if your opinion devalues who I am as a human being, right? And so being able to draw that line and that boundary really clearly for people. And then, of course, the only way you're going to help people move forward is education, right? Being able to offer that education in a separate space where it doesn't take away space, time, or doesn't create a harmful conversation for folks that actually hold that identity in that room.
One. Oh, it's on. Okay, just making sure. So, in my opinion, I feel like if you sugarcoat it, it makes them feel like they're not like a person like y'all. So like I think that you should just like be honest, but like make sure you choose your words in a way that it's not offensive to them, because everybody, like, we're all people. So if you be like, well, this, that, and the third, like, it's not going to make any sense, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. You understand or no? Yeah. Okay.
Right.
I'm just making sure.
I think the only thing I would add that I do with teachers more than young people is, I don't really care if somebody thinks it's wrong to be who I am, me personally. Like, I don't care what you believe about sexual orientation. You have an obligation to treat people with respect and dignity, regardless of what you believe. So I think helping people distinguish between, yeah, you get a right to your belief and value system, but that does not allow you to treat somebody with disrespect and not in a dignified way. And so that's what I do with teachers. I don't, if it's about intervening and bullying, it's like, who cares? They're being bullied. Intervene, right? And then if you have a question about who they are, let's have that conversation in a respectful way, right? So I think, and we've had 10th graders say, I think it's wrong to be gay, but it's also wrong to exclude, tease, harass somebody. So if 10th graders can figure that out, right, adults should be able to figure it out too.
Mm.
Theoretically. Hello, President Trump. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this really interesting set of talks. I'm curious, and I'm going to blame it on Stacey, but you presented the UN Convention on Children's Rights document, which gave me flashbacks to the sad reality that this country has not endorsed those tenets, those principles. But it makes me think about, I guess, issues that sort of go beyond schools, and also Emma's talk pointed out that a substantial percentage of these youth are homeless youth, and I just wonder, if anyone could speak to sort of the need, the kinds of policies that go beyond how youth are treated in schools. But, for example, we have other systems, healthcare system, we have the justice system, we have other systems where institutionalized discrimination and racism and all these things are also taking place. And I worry very much about especially these homeless youth who may not have voices or advocates, and whether they might be falling through the cracks. And I just wondered if anyone could speak to this sort of broader issue. It might be an unfair question, but I think it might be interesting to hear some of your perspectives on this. Thank you.
Okay. Absolutely. I mean, I think we need policies in almost every single institutional area you can think of. If you pay attention even a tiny little bit, you will see how incredibly gendered every single piece of our world is, right? And so whether you're talking about healthcare or housing or employment, we need policies in every single area, right? In Virginia, you can still be fired for being gay, right? Most housing services are separated by gender. The staff are not trained. They are not safe for LGBTQ people. And so LGBTQ people don't have access to a lot of those resources. So the other piece I'll say around that is policy is really important. It's also very important to acknowledge that in order to fix that system, there is a lot of trust repairing and a lot of trust building and a lot of relationship building that needs to be done, right? You can write a great anti-bullying policy, and most of our youth are in school. Almost every single school at this point has an anti-bullying policy. Almost no school that I've ever worked with actually enforces that anti-bullying policy, right? So you can write a great policy, and it's a great place to start. And if you don't actually train people on how that looks on a day-to-day basis, if you don't change the cultures of institutions and organizations, and if you don't intentionally reach out to build relationship and build trust, it's not going to change anything, right? So I think, again, going back to when we think about intersectionality, not just do you have to make spaces for people to bring their whole selves everywhere, but you also have to address every level, right? You have to address relational and personal and institutional and structural, all those pieces in order to actually make change.
And I'll add one thing, which is related to, Stacey, you mentioned it, which is getting to the root causes, right? So what is it that actually underlies the problems, whether it's homelessness or bullying? The policy is important, but the ideologies that underlie it, right? So the white supremacy, the anti-blackness, the patriarchy, those sorts of belief systems, meritocracy, capitalism, right? Like on and on. The things that are just normative about what it means to be American, what it means to live in this country, and those sorts of beliefs and ideologies are the root causes. So you could write a policy, but if white supremacy is still accepted, there will be ways to subvert that policy, right? And so that sort of intersectionality component and getting to not just even structural, but really ideologies, and thinking about the foundations on which our country is built.
The question I've had, like, ever since I've been bullied is, like, why? Just like, why would you bully me? And then, like, I came to the conclusion that most people bully because, one, they're either upset or bitter, or two, that they're upset because, like, they're all the same, and, like, I'm different, and, like, I have all my different values, while you're the same with your friends, I'm being different with my friends.
I think the other thing that we don't do a good job of is really thinking about, and Dr. Tolan brought this up earlier, cross-sector collaboration, right? So if we think about the story of a queer young person whose family doesn't accept them, they get kicked out, they end up on the street, maybe they get put in a social service agency that's gender binary, so they don't feel comfortable there, it's not safe in terms of kind of homophobic harassment. So it's actually safer for them to be on the street than in a facility, right? And then maybe they, break the law, or they do something, they get, arrested for being on the corner and young and black or queer, right? And then they violate probation because the only way they can get to side by side is to go out of the district, and then they get arrested, right? So if we look at the safety nets that are available for certain kinds of young people and how the systems actually work against their development and their thriving, we're not doing a good job of sort of figuring that out. Like if a decision was just made differently at one point in that trajectory, that young person's whole life would be altered, right? So one of the organizations we worked with in the discipline study was a residential facility specifically for queer young people. So it only worked with young people, queer young people facing housing instability. It's a 14-bed facility, right? And they commit to young people till they're economically kind of independent and viable or back in school. So there's just not a lot of beds for folks that are safe.
We, Side by Side has the only LGBTQ housing program in the state. We have 6 spots. We just recently were able to convince the city of Richmond that youth housing and homelessness might be a problem. So like that's where we are.
We do have time for another question or two. Sure.
Sort of a little follow-up, because we're doing a lot of work in rural areas in Missouri, and so these facts that you all mentioned, I mean, a couple of things. My guess is that most of the work that's being done with intersectional youth is probably urban areas. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that tends to be the case, at least with Latinos and Latinas. And of course, we know the poverty that exists in these rural communities, and frankly, the sort of ideologies and attitudes that tend to predominate many of these rural communities, not all. Again, if someone could speak a little bit to efforts to try to work with queer youth that intersect with other demographics in rural areas, and what are ways that we can sort of begin to meet the needs of that population, which I would imagine is pretty isolated and marginalized. Thank you.
Yeah. I could be going out on a limb here, but I think we don't study rural youth generally enough in developmental psychology, right? And sort of how we think about that as a form of intersectionality in terms of sort of geographic region that you grow up in that impacts sort of what you have access to, the resources, the homogeneity, all of those things. So is it particularly complicated to study queer youth in rural spaces? Probably more complicated than urban spaces. But Renee Gallagher was doing it many, many years ago, but I don't know if she's followed up on that. I know Paul Poteet's work with GSAs is looking across the state of Massachusetts, so he has schools kind of across those spaces. We're attempting to try to get out of the Chicagoland area to sort of think about, and that's like the third point of the Safe Schools movement, diverse lives in diverse contexts. If the closest LGBT center is 100 miles away, how do you support a kid, right? So things like summer camp, action camps, where kids come from all over the place, is sort of what we've been doing. So we get kids from all over Illinois, and then in an attempt to follow them up kind of back into their home spaces to say, who are your champions in those spaces, right? But it's totally an understudied area.
So I teach at a university in which the undergraduate college is still all women. And we have bent over backwards to create an environment that I think a lot of people would say is fairly comfortable for students who are exploring sexual orientation and gender identity. I would also say that I think we feel that we are empowering our students to be strong resistors, right? But one of the things that we are beginning to worry about is what happens when they graduate and they go out into the world and they are in the workforce or trying to get housing or living, regular, normal lives, where they're not surrounded by supportive adults who are interested in the journey that they are taking. And so thinking about this as a conference about moral reasoning, what is it that we need to do to prepare young students who are still working through or on that identity with, on that journey with sexual orientation and gender identity? what do we need to do to help them to stay resilient as they go out into the world, knowing that the world is going to continue to be toxic, knowing that those policies may be on the books, but nobody's going to try to implement them. What can we do while we have them to give them the tools?
Can I put it back on you? So if you were at an HBCU, what would you do for the black students?
So the first thing I'd say,
Knowing they're going to go back into a
absolutely, is find community and stay with that community, right? Find those people who understand what you're going through, people who love you no matter what, right? And also know your history and know that there was a time in which life for people like us was a whole lot worse. And yet we found a way to keep moving forward. And you have to join that group of resistors, because that's, that's what you're on the earth to do.
So you already know how to do it.
I would add, I think we could probably answer that question for about 3 hours.
Yeah.
One thing that I think we don't talk about enough in youth development, we talk a lot about, filling youth's toolboxes with all of these skills and coping skills and resilience and all these things. We don't talk about joy a whole lot. And so how do we instill in our youth not just ways to survive and get through the day, but also like how do you find joy in your life? How do you celebrate? LGBTQ youth, every LGBTQ youth, many people who aren't LGBTQ, at some point asked a question about who they are, right? How is that not the most beautiful thing in the whole world, right? That they looked at themselves and they said, right? I'm gonna learn more about myself and I'm gonna step into this. Like, how do we not celebrate that every single moment of every single day? So how do we instill in them that this isn't something that's happened to you, right? This is something to be proud of, to celebrate, to find joy in, and be able to shift that framework for them, that it's not something that you have to survive, it's something that you get to experience because you've chosen that, right? You've chosen to be willing to step into that as opposed to trying to push it away. And I think that framework shift is really, really helpful.
I'll quickly add. I was just going to say, similar, this idea of sort of preparation for bias, right? That you hold the two truths. Because sometimes I find in conversations, like I've had colleagues say things like, we have to prepare our students of color to be, tough for the real world. And I'm like, well, the real world will come. we don't need to toughen them up for it, right? Like that will come. But that there is something really powerful about cultivating and nurturing, right? Their sense of self and that strong, confident connection to who they are. While also saying, this may not shine so bright in every context, right? But you can come back to knowing this knowledge, and so that, that safety of a supportive environment doesn't have to be a problem, and it doesn't have to be something that leads them to stumble when they head out. But if we pretend the world is equally supportive, then that does become a problem, right? Like we can speak what's happening, but also not expose them to it, to prepare them in that way,
And I will add quickly that I think also, we talk a lot about how are we supporting or building capacity in the young people, and I also sort of think that the adults need to take some onus on this, right? I mean, we are all, presumably the adults who are in this room are here because we care about this, and the reason the system is what it is because of adults. And so we also need to really think about how we are bringing our adult peers along with us and helping to build adult capacity. So I'll just say that. With that, we are going to close this panel. Please join me in thanking them.